It's great to welcome to the program today Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin, who represents Maryland's 8th Congressional District, was the lead House manager in the second impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump. Congressman, it's so great to have you on.
I'm delighted to be with you, David. Thank you for having me.
So, okay, to start with, we're going to have, starting with in prime time on June 9th, these public hearings related to the January 6th committee. And there are sort of two opposing forces here. There's one side, yourself included, who have been saying what's going to be revealed during those hearings is going to be mind-blowing. That's my term, not necessarily a term that you have used. The other side is this feeling that nothing's really going to happen. Nobody's ultimately going to be held accountable for what happened. What can you say to those in my audience who are in that latter group who are concerned about lack of accountability?
This is all part of the process of making the events of January 6th visible, comprehensible to people, and making them the basis of real accountability. Now, some of that accountability is legal accountability, and that's really within the realm of the Department of Justice, which has brought more than 800 prosecutions in the most sweeping investigation in the history of the DOJ. Obviously, we're all on the edge of our seats to see if they're going to work their way all the way up to the top, or whether Trump, as a kind of mob boss, is able to insulate himself with several layers of buffer between him and the criminal actions and the legal consequences of those actions. But I do think that the investigation is proceeding apace, and they're working their way up the way that a lot of organized crime investigations work their way up the ladder. But then there's public and political accountability, and that's really what the January 6th Select Committee is all about. I mean, under House Resolution 503, our job is to report to Congress and to the American people about what happened on January 6th and what were the causes behind it, and then to make recommendations about how to fortify our institutions going forward.
Do you expect some of your colleagues in the House may have legal liability?
Well, first of all, again, that's not really our role. In other words,
Understood.
we're turning over evidence of people who are in contempt of Congress because they refuse to participate. For example, Dan Scavino and Peter Navarro, they never gave a single document to the committee. They never spent 1 minute testifying. They just blew us off. Mark Meadows was kind of 1 foot in and 1 foot out, doing the hokey pokey, gave us some stuff, and then Trump got mad, withdrew. Steve Bannon's blown us off. We've turned all of that information over to the Department of Justice. We voted to hold them in contempt, and now it's up to the executive branch and the DOJ to enforce that. In terms of evidence of other crimes, we're in the process of laying them out there. In the John Eastman litigation, when Judge Carter was dealing with Eastman's claim that he was somehow covered by attorney-client privilege, the judge asked the question, well, was there an attorney-client privilege? Was it waived? And does it even apply if it existed because of the crime fraud exception? And we said there was no attorney-client privilege. If there was, it was waived. And, in any event, it doesn't apply because all of these crimes were committed and we set them forth. And Judge Carter basically adopted what we had to say. So we've not been shy about setting forth statutory offenses. But look, as much as we all would like to see Donald Trump and others in his inner echelon held legally accountable, far more important is whether or not we can solidify our democratic institutions and keep the engines of democracy turning. I mean, that's just so much more important than how Donald Trump spends the remaining years of his life, whether it's behind bars or somewhere else. I care a lot more about whether or not we are going to be able to bequeath the democracy, a working, functional democracy, to our children and our grandchildren, because the autocrats, the dictators, the despots are on the march all over the world. And from Moscow to Mar-a-Lago, they're working to undermine democratic process and to drain life from our institutions. And we've got to make sure we've got something to give our kids.
Yeah, to that end, I mean, it seems very clear that at least to some degree, some of the people who are trying to avoid coming before your committee are trying to run out the clock, knowing that if Republicans take the House in November and are sworn in January, this committee is essentially over. Is your plan to be done long before that in order to prevent an interruption before you're done with your work as a result of the election?
Yeah, able to have our hearings begin June 9th. There will be 6 hearings at least that take place in the month of June. There will be perhaps another hearing or two in the future to deliver the recommendations of the committee, and there will be a report. And we're hoping to have all of that done early in the fall. It's not just our committee that ends with this Congress. Everything ends with this Congress because House of Representatives, unlike the Senate, is a newly constituted body every 2 years. We come to the end of the Congress, and then there's a new Congress that forms. The Senate, because of the overlapping nature of their terms, is a continuing body. They only lose 1/3 of their members, or 1/3 of their members are up for re-election, whereas our entire body's up for re-election, and we adopt new rules at the beginning of the House, and so on. So it's not any kind of strategic political calculus. It's just that we've got to get this done before this session of Congress ends.
Okay, when it comes to gun safety, there have been some of your colleagues who have said something feels different this time. We've seen a couple of Republicans, including Adam Kinzinger and Congressman Jacobs, who have said, I actually have a new position when it comes to either an assault weapons ban or AR-15. There's something that might be a little bit different this time. But we've seen this cycle for a long time, which is there's a mass shooting. Everybody says we must do something. Republicans come in and say, oh, yeah, sure, but that can include actually dealing with gun safety. And then there's no major shooting in the news for a couple of weeks and nothing happens, and it's rinse repeat for year after year after year. Is your genuine opinion that this is going to be that same cycle, or that maybe something will be different this time?
Well, my colleagues senior to me believe it is going to be the exact same thing it's been before, because the NRA exerts such a stranglehold over the GOP. And in the final analysis, they will refuse to move. On the other hand, I'm of the mind that the Republicans think that they are in a place where they can actually seize control of the House and the Senate, and they can win these elections. They've obviously been vilifying and demonizing Joe Biden, and yet they're starting to realize that the public is overwhelmingly against them on all the big issues. I mean, they are the dog that caught the car when it comes to destroying Roe versus Wade and the constitutional right to privacy.
Yep.
So that creates explosive political conditions where the women of America can turn en masse against the GOP and what they've done to destroy women's reproductive freedom. Similarly, the gun violence is so out of control and so dangerous and frightening to people that they could experience a similar earthquake with young people in America who just say enough is enough. And the young people who really rocked American politics from Parkland, Florida, with the March for Our Lives, are organizing another march and people are saying that hundreds of thousands or maybe even 1 million people could come to Washington. So I think that the GOP may have the sense that their big chance to do what they really care about most, which is taking power, could all be squandered because of the recklessness of their policies. And so that would argue that they might try to do something so that they're not so clearly the party that is tagged with all these massacres. One of my constituents wrote me the other day with the idea that the massacres should be named after the Republican members of Congress and the senators whose districts and states they represent, when those are the members who are doing nothing to get us a universal violent criminal background check, doing nothing to close the gun show loophole, the internet loophole, the private sale loophole, doing nothing to take weapons of war out of the hands of 18-year-olds and, essentially reduce the slaughter, which puts America into a class completely of its own. I mean, we're suffering gun casualties 20 times, 25, 50 times higher than other industrialized countries. And it's all because of our gun.
On that note, many of my liberal friends who are for all sorts of different gun safety regulations, which I know you support and which I support, also are of the mindset that they don't love the idea of only the right wingers having the guns, and they are increasingly seeking firearms themselves and obtaining them, almost like a race to the bottom of sorts, if you will. Do you sympathize with that fear? Does that make sense to you to some degree?
Well, I mean, the Supreme Court, of course, in Heller versus District of Columbia, said that the core of the individual right under the Second Amendment is the right of self-defense in your home. And people have that right. That's deeply anchored in American culture and law. So if there are people who are fearful for that reason, and they feel that firearms will keep them safe, they have a right to exercise their Second Amendment rights in that way. Of course, the liberals in the Supreme Court had advanced the traditional view, which is that the Second Amendment is about the right to possess guns in connection with malicious service. In other words, you read the prefatory clause, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the survival of a free state, in conjunction with the operative clause, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In any event, the conservative majority won on that, but even Justice Scalia was emphatic that reasonable gun regulation is totally within the contemplation of the Second Amendment. And you don't have to sell assault weapons to anybody, and you don't have to allow kids to get weapons, and you don't have to allow people to take weapons in public places. I hope we have not arrived at Civil War style conditions. But I think it's perfectly healthy for people across the political spectrum to exercise their Second Amendment rights, but it's also perfectly healthy for us to understand what Second Amendment rights really are,
right,
and what the authority of government is to guarantee public safety, because that's essential to the social contract. And the whole reason we get into a social contract, if you read Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau, is that we surrender the rights of violent self-help in exchange for security in a civil society. But the Republicans who refuse to do nothing essentially, give us the worst of both worlds. They compel kids to go to school under the truancy laws, under the mandatory attendance laws, but then they leave them as sitting ducks because they won't do anything to keep them safe from mass slaughter with assault weapons.
Congressman, last thing I want to ask you about, and I know our time is not unlimited. I'm not an advocate of a primary challenge to Joe Biden. I think if Joe Biden decides to run for re-election, that he should be the Democratic nominee from a strategic point of view. That being said, when people say to me, David, is there anyone you think would be interesting to see as the Democratic nominee? To be totally honest, I think of you. I think of John Ossoff. I think John Ossoff would be very interesting. I know that it would be a crazy thing to ask you. If it's something you're thinking about, you would never answer it. It would be inappropriate. It would be a crazy thing to ask. But my more specific question is, one of the things I do think is, I think that unfortunately, because of anti-Semitism on both the right and some on the left, I think Jewish presidential candidates would still struggle because of anti-Semitism. What's your opinion about that issue in America right now?
I hadn't really thought that through, David. Let me see. And I wonder if you're asking me this because I happen to be in New Hampshire campaigning for my friends Chris Pappas and Annie Custer and for Senator Maggie Hassan. But look, I think it's really important for the young people of America to understand, and the kids of America to understand, despite what they might see on the internet and despite what they might hear from some people in public office, we are not a racist country. We are not an anti-Semitic country. We are not a sexist, misogynistic country. We are not an immigrant bashing country. And I believe so much in what Tom Paine saw when he got to America. I mean, he said this country could become an asylum for humanity. Not an insane asylum, mind you, but it could become a place of refuge for people fleeing from every form of political, religious, economic repression and discrimination on earth. And I think despite what we've lived with through Donald Trump and the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the militia groups and the 3%ers, and despite all of the divisiveness and the polarization, I still believe we are the world's greatest multiracial, multi-religious, multi-ethnic constitutional democracy. And the sky's the limit for what we can make happen for our people once we fight off all of these authoritarian, racist attacks on our country. So, there would be a lot of reasons that I wouldn't run for president, but being Jewish would not be one of them.
Congressman Jamie Raskin, I really appreciate your time, and we're going to be watching next week as the hearings start very closely. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, David.